All right, here we go. So as you know, we're here to talk about administering Power BI. So I have three main goals for this session. One is to really talk about how being a Power BI administrator is not the same thing for every single person, and it varies. And I really want to introduce the breadth and scope of the responsibilities, and that's important because that means that we're really going to be doing an overview session here. We're going to be doing a few demos, but none of them do we have time to go in an inordinate amount of detail. And then we're going to conclude with, depending on where you're at, some suggestions for what you might do next. So here's the flow that we're going to take today. Here's each one of the sections we're going to cover. What we're going to do is going to kind of pause between each section, check the chat, check and see if there are any questions that you have, and we'll try to get that done. We'll have, unless we're running a little late with questions during the session, we should also have a little time at the end as well. We're also, timing-wise, we're actually planning on this taking about an hour and a half. So this is an extended session. They will post the video online if you're not available to stay for the whole time. And if you'd like a copy of these materials, either now or later, head on over to my website. There's a community resources area. That's where you'll find the slides and the diagram that you're about to see that Prathy mentioned earlier as well. Now, in addition to you being able to ask us a few questions in the chat, I'm going to be asking you a few questions during this session as well. So what I'd like you to do is go pop open a browser window and go to this web address, please. And Prathy, if you wouldn't mind popping that URL in the chat as well, that would be helpful for people.
Yeah, sure.
I'll give you a moment to make sure you've got that, and then we're going to dive right in with our first question. And that is, I would like to know if administration is really technically or formally part of your job role. So far, I'm not surprised, and I'd actually be shocked if anyone says yes full time. Okay, there you go. Shock me. I would expect there's very few full-timers unless you're in a very large organization. Interestingly, that by far it's the not officially, but it falls in your lap anyways. All right, I like it. Okay, one more question for you. And that is, what kind of department are you part of? So which one of these three is at least closest? IT, a business unit, or one of those teams that bridges them both, that is able to basically serve both groups as independently as you possibly can? I'm really encouraged that most of you are from the third one. That's very cool. I love it. All right, thanks everybody. All right, we'll have a few more of those during the session. So what I'd like to do first is talk about some approaches, basically some mindset or things I want you to think about, and then a few roles and responsibilities. And so we're not going to review this in depth. This is the thing that Prathy mentioned earlier, and I did just update it, I don't know, 2 or 3 days ago for a few small changes. The thing that I want you to know, especially if you're kind of new to figuring out what is in the world of Power BI, is that it's this broad set of tools, and it integrates with a whole lot of different things. So when someone says to you Power BI, well, what does that mean? Are they talking about desktop? Are they talking about the service? Or are they really just talking about the whole ecosystem? So know that it's very, very wide. It's more than just a reporting tool, which of course is why it needs attention to management, governance, security, all those kinds of things that I tend to get excited about. Now, there's a lot of overlap between areas. You know, administration doesn't have a really nice tidy box around it. And depending on the size of your company and how your staffing is structured, your administrator might be asked to get involved with a lot of those things that are kind of circling around administration. So that's kind of the first thing to have you be aware of. The other thing to be aware of is that there's these different ways to deploy BI in general, regardless of tool, right? On the first column, we've got the business-led self-service BI, and the business folks might be in charge of everything end to end. On the far right, we might have that BI or a central team might be in charge of everything end to end. And then, of course, in the middle, you've got that blended approach. And a lot of times that's the ideal that we're shooting for, where you've got a centralized team providing cleansed, curated data and giving flexibility to your authors throughout the organization to create the reports and the visualizations and extend the data as they need to, but they're not constantly reinventing the wheel. And so column 1 might be the starting point for some places, and that might lead to a lot of chaos, but it also leads to a lot of freedom to get things done. But column 3 might be the starting point in another organization, especially if there's a good, successful corporate data warehouse in place. And so the main message I want you to take from this is that every organization usually has all 3 in place, and it can differ by organizational group or even by project which one of these approaches is actually in play. And that affects, you know, the hat you wear as an administrator, because of course it affects what people are trying to do. And then the other thing that affects is, well, are we talking about broad organizational BI, or are we talking about very fine personal BI, or something in between? And of course, as you can imagine, organizational BI needs greater oversight because it, it includes more people as using that data and that information. And then also, as you can imagine, organizational BI and corporate BI has a whole lot less flexibility and the ability to actually be agile and just make quick changes and throw them out there without formal change management and that sort of thing. And that all might influence some of your policies for how you administer a tool like Power BI. And finally, the other kinds of things that are going to influence things are, well, kind of where are you at maturity level wise of data management? And I don't say that in a judgmental way. Not everything needs to be a Cadillac, but that's going to influence how things are done. So is your data culture, what expectations there are and what things are encouraged in your organization. And then finally, external factors like compliance and our favorite regulatory regs and, industry influences, all of that sort of thing. So those are all the reasons why administrator roles are different in different places. So having said that, who's allowed to be a Power BI admin? And, there's this trade-off, right? We want people to get things done and get things done quickly, but we want to do that with minimizing risk. And so it's important to audit your security changes that are made by an administrator, especially when it affects themselves. And so you're going to see me reiterate this here in just a couple of minutes, but an administrator can turn around and provide themselves access to any workspace, which makes the data available. So for that reason, I like it when there's a process in place that justifies workspace access. So not just the auditing is happening, right? But we know that workspace access exists for what reason. And we're going to talk more about that here in just a moment. So if we say we want the administrator role to apply to very few people, well, how do we go about reducing the number of administrators? There's a really nice feature in Azure called, we refer to it as PIM, so Privileged Identity Management. And so what we're doing here is we're removing the risk of having a domain user have permanent full-time elevated permissions. And you know what else it does? It removes the need to have that second admin account that you log in with that one when you need to use it, which has worked for years and years and years. However, this is nicer. So let me tell you logically how this works, and then I'm going to show you what it looks like for real. So logically how it works is your administrator sets up these PIM roles in Azure and sets up eligible members. And I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. Then the user or this eligible member says, I need to do some work. So I'm gonna request to activate my elevated access. And then if applicable, you know, this is optional, but someone could be required to approve that. Either way, it's audited. So the approval may or may not really need to occur. Then the user they become a member of that role. And in our case, we're talking about the Power BI administrator role, right? And then it expires at a certain number of hours. And then the user is removed from that role. So let me pop out for a second and show you what that looks like. So where I'm at here is in Azure, in the Privileged Identity Management or PIM area. And let me just kind of start from the main area. There's two areas to manage Azure AD roles and Azure resources. I'm using the Azure AD roles. And if I go here into assign eligibility, and I'm going to sort descending by eligible just to find that and show you that I've got PIM eligibility currently set up for two roles. This is my demo environment. So for the Power BI administrator, if I go in and I take a look, my admin user that I call Griffin, who used to be one of my dogs, he's set to be an eligible member. But although he's eligible permanently, he's not always a full-time member. So now that it's configured, I'm going to go to a different window. And this particular window is logged in as Griffin. And so when he says, I need to do something as a Power BI administrator, what he would do is he would go into PIM and he would say, my eligible roles are these two right here. I want to activate my Power BI administrator role. He would say, oh, I don't really need this for 10 hours. I probably only need it for 2 hours. And I need to update, you know, blah, 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 blah. You give you know, your beautiful excuse and request it to activate. I'm going to hit cancel and just kind of to save time, show you what ends up happening. The person that I have set to approve the request to be elevated gets an email. So, okay, Griffin has requested. He has said, I need to enable the blah, blah, blah tenant setting because we disabled it, you know, in error, that kind of thing. And then I can go approve or deny that request. Then we get an acknowledgement that, oh, okay, that got activated. And then Griffin goes off and he gets his work done and it expires at the end of the number of hours. So that's a really nice, elegant way to be able to handle this sort of scenario. So now that you know a little bit about, you know, minimizing the number of administrators and such, I'd kind of like to know out of curiosity how the administrators are handled at your company. All right, not bad. Not bad, okay, good. So the next thing that I want to introduce is this idea of the Power BI administrator role versus groups. So there is a role in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. And essentially what happens there is the people that are granted membership in that role are allowed to be Power BI administrators. And what that looks like, where I'm at here is in the admin center, and I'm here in the roles area, and there is the Power BI admin right here. And so if I select this, you can see that Peyton, which used to be one of my cats, you see a trend here. Peyton is my one permanent full-time person that's just always assigned the administrator role. So you don't see Griffin here. Griffin does it through that PIM process on an as-needed basis, rather than being assigned full-time here. All right, so we know now that we've got our Power BI admin role, and global admins are also, implicitly Power BI administrators. What I want to do is propose to you that a mail-enabled security group for Power BI administrators is also a good thing to have. And unfortunately, as it stands right now, we can't have a group that's just that group is a member of the role. Sadly, it doesn't work right now. Hopefully that'll come one of these days. So at the moment, it's kind of two different things. But I still think having a group of administrators is useful for these reasons. One is in your Power BI workspace, you're going to have auditing reports, health reports, maybe adoption reports, things like that, BI on BI kind of idea here, and you can set the security for that to your group. There's also various tenant settings that you can set specific to the group. For instance, service notifications, or the new one that our premium capacity is undergoing some demand, and to let you know of that. Then there's also alert policies. We're going to look at that here in just a moment. We can use that group to receive alerts when something is happening, and then also just kind of your miscellaneous, emails and such to the group of users. So I propose that you have both in place. Now, Power BI Administrator, we have a handful of roles that have administrator in their name. So there's the Power BI Service Administrator, and most often when someone says Power BI Administrator, most often they're talking about this. And so really the question then becomes is, well, gateway and premium capacity and those sorts of things, is that included in the reference or not? And then I left it on this list, Workspace Administrator. That's named that way because the workspace admin can manage everything about the workspace. However, I don't really think of it as an admin in the same sense. Now, this isn't a thorough list, but administratively, we can get involved with so many different aspects, and it can involve a lot of different things. And in addition to that, there's also other teams involved, not all the time, but some of the time. And so it requires a lot of help from other people, usually in IT, but might be other teams like internal audit and risk management and security, that sort of thing. Okay, so before we dive into the Power BI service, let's check and see if we have any questions. What I need to do is find, just a moment, I need to find this again on my second screen. So the first question that I see is, who should approve the user request? And what role do you need to create Azure AD apps? I'd have to double check that. There is something below your Azure Global Administrator that allows you to create AAD apps. And I think that there's even a little knob that makes it fairly wide open in your organization, but I would have to double check exactly what that is. But there is a specific role for that. But who should approve the user request? I mean, that's kind of a tough one, right? It depends. My thought is that if it's the actual administrator, I would want it to be because that is formally something that was decided previously should be done by the administrator and not just off the cuff. Having a predetermined way to handle it, I guess, is my only real firm thought there. Okay, let me start diving into the Power BI service because there's, of course, a few really important things here. And the place to start is tenant settings. And those are really right up there at the top of the list of the things that you need to get right. So I have 4 suggestions for you. One is document why the tenant settings are the way they are. And so that will help you later, or even explaining to others with why are we not allowing, for instance, printing or exports, right? The justification. And I also want you to make that documentation available to your user population. So your decentralized users, the ones that would otherwise have no idea why some feature they're reading about online isn't actually working. And then where it's appropriate, and a perfect example of this is push apps to end users. If someone says, I want to be able to do that, that's going to help me so much, tell them how you go about getting approved to be in whichever group you need to be in to do that. That just reduces the frustration immensely from people that are like, I don't know, it's supposed to work and it doesn't work. I have no idea, right? Reduces that friction between, whoever is managing the system and the rest of the company. And then I want you to track the activity log for when tenant settings happen and set up alerts for when a tenant setting change occurs. And I just actually blogged about this the other day. So let me show you how this all works. So first of all, just to make sure when we're talking about tenant settings that everybody knows exactly what we're referring to, where I'm at is I am in the admin portal. So here's where you have to have that Power BI administrator role assigned to you to be able to see this. But a whole lot of different things are set here that actually influence how the system behaves or what things people can do. So for instance, in my demo tenant here, sensitivity labels, I say anybody in the entire organization can set them. Your company might say, oh no, wait a second, we need to set that to a certain group of users. So for instance, share content with external users, I have a specific group called, Power BI guest user sharing that I have that is allowed to do that. So that's kind of what I meant by giving people information on what they need to do to ask for permission to do this, right? How do you get to be a Power BI certification subject matter expert, for instance? Okay, so let's say you've got all these tenant settings set exactly the way you want, and you just want to make sure nothing changes without your knowledge. So one way to do that is the activity log, and we're going to talk more about that in a couple of minutes. The other thing that I want to point out is available, and I got to find the right window because I got way too many of them open. We've got an application called Cloud App Security. Now this does require a separate license, and it does require separate permissions than Power BI administrator permissions. So assuming that you can do this, what I have done here is I have created this policy that says I basically want to know when any administrative activity occurs. So how I've configured mine is I've said every single time that this happens, and what's happening? Well, the app is Power BI and administrative activity is true. And so I'm going to send an alert email to my Power BI administrators group. And I could also do a text message, and I could also loop it in with Power Automate if I wanted to. And then there's other things, because Cloud App Security does a lot of stuff. There's other different things that you can do with regard to suspending users or requiring to sign in again, etc. I'm not doing, any of that kind of stuff. So what happens when a tenant setting does change? If I go back over to Peyton, my Power BI administrator, his email account, here's the kind of email that he gets when that happens. And so it looks like the printing tenant setting was set to true. And so a couple of things that are important to know here is that it tells us Griffin changed this on what day and what time, but it doesn't tell us what was the state before and what was the state after. And it doesn't tell us, oh, you had it set to 2 groups before and now it's set to 3 groups, right? It's really just a change occurred when and by whom. So it's not, and the same thing's true for the activity log, by the way. So it's not the be all and end all, but it is helpful as a complement to your activity log, especially if you're kind of stuck in a situation where we've had to say yes to a fair number of people to be administrators. And so one thing I really hope that we see at some point in the Power BI service is basically a read-only rule for administrators, because what would be really helpful in these big decentralized companies is the ability to be able to at least view what these settings are, but not be able to change them. And that would help some things. But as it stands right now, that doesn't exist. All right, so let me skip past these right here. All right, now, based on what I've already said, you should know the answer to this. But I want to ask you this question before we proceed to see what you tell me at this point. Come on, I dare somebody to say no. Oh, you had to go into it, didn't you? You had to. All right, so I'm going to tell you why this is yes. And that is all about, I'm showing you the graphical interface here, but this is also true in PowerShell. For the people in the Power BI administrator role, there is this workspace management area. And if I pop over there and I take a look at this workspace, not only can I see the details and the metadata of it, I can adjust access. And so, basically that means we can set access to ourselves or our buddy down the hall if we want to, which basically turns around and means in addition to just metadata throughout the organization, the actual data could be made available as well. So that's why I very much consider it to be a high privileged role. Okay. Done beating that horse. Let's talk about a few other things to be aware of in the admin center. So one of them is your ability to manage embed codes. So first thing is this is related to the publish to web feature. And so if you've been in the Power BI world for very long, you will have heard the advice to be very, very careful with publish to web because it is absolutely wide open. So even if you think you are making it quote unquote secure by using it on your intranet or something like that, it's not. And so this should be very, very tightly controlled. So you can do that through your activity log monitoring, and you can also validate the active embed codes on a regular basis on this page as well. There's also the aspect of managing organizational visuals. And so this falls to the Power BI administrator and is something that you would end up getting requests from your user population to help you with this. So recommendations here are: 1, consider setting your tenant setting to allow certified visuals only. And by certified visuals only, what I mean there is in app source, they have set to be certified, and that means they've undergone some validation from Microsoft. There's no, bad code. It's not sending data outside of the service and so forth. Then you also want to set your group policy setting so that Power BI Desktop behaves the same way as the Power BI service. And that's going to save you from the situation where somebody's done a lot of work in Power BI Desktop only to find that it doesn't work when you hit the service. So that's done in group policy to say certified visuals only. And then you might say, but Melissa, we've got something that we need to use that isn't certified. This organizational visuals pane is how you handle those exceptions. So maybe you've got something you internally developed that, of course, it's not going to be sitting as a certified visual in AppSource. Maybe you've got a vendor that isn't certified, but is positively trustworthy and approved for use in your company. And a really good example of that is maybe they are transmitting data to their service so they can make calls to run a machine learning algorithm. Well, when that happens, it can't be certified because it's sending data out, but it's supposed to send data out. So those kinds of situations you can manage here through organizational visuals. And when you manage them this way, if you update the visual, the version of it gets pushed to everybody in the org, as opposed to having people manage the little PBI viz files one by one on their own, which then gets to be tough to manage. Then another thing that's in the admin area are data flow settings. I get the feeling that this might change over time here. There are some limitations right now. What this is about is if you're using data flows and you want to essentially associate an Azure Data Lake account that you already have. And the advantage to this is then you can actually see the data behind the scenes, and you can use other tools on that same data if you wanted to. So it's kind of a bring your own data lake kind of idea. And so it exposes that underlying data. And there's some stuff on the release plan that they don't elaborate on terribly much right now. But so at this point, I would say just be kind of careful with a proof of concept, because what we can do right now is pretty limited, like we can't change it or remove it once it's set, that kind of thing. Also in the admin center is this notion of featured content. And that puts things like certain reports in the featured section on the homepage. Again, something that your business users are probably going to control. And so there is a tenant setting that allows who can do that. But, the admin can determine, how sparingly this might be used so that it doesn't get too mucked up. Again, one of those things that then the admin needs to kind of partner with the business users a little bit to figure out what they need. And then monitoring system health. There's a few things to be aware of here. There's the support site for Power BI. So the things that get posted there are the broad public awareness things that are hitting, I think, if not all customers, a large number of customers. The Azure status, that's where you're going to look for your Power BI embedded service. That also might be helpful if you do have other services that are related, things like Azure Data Lake we just talked about, things like cognitive services or machine learning that you might be using with your data flows, things of that nature. And then also, this one's kind of interesting. So for high priority incidents, they're also logged inside your Microsoft 365 Admin Center. To get to this takes more than just the Power BI admin role, but this is where you would get the full root cause, start and end time, the full accountability from Microsoft because some high priority thing happened. The data here, I believe, only stays for 30 days. All right, time to pause briefly and check for questions. let's see. I do see the one on, is there a way to let Power BI administrators to see content inside my workspace? The answer to that is no. So the thing that I thank you for bringing that up, because I did neglect to mention that. The thing that I described really only applies to regular workspaces. So initially we had app workspace and my workspace to differentiate between the two workspaces, and that nomenclature of app workspace has apparently been confusing for the customer base. So now it's just workspaces and some of them are my workspace. So I then tend to stutter about a little bit when I say, you know, anything that's not my workspace. Let's see here. Can you restrict gateway installers? Yes, you can. We're going to get to that here in just a few minutes. Okay, I think we're caught up on questions, so let me press on. Okay. So now I want to talk about usage monitoring. And so the idea of usage monitoring with Power BI is immensely, wildly critical. And let me give you a few reasons why. So one of them is, you know, finding what's used most. So what if a data refresh isn't as reliable as it should be? Or what if a report that's shared from someone's My Workspace is suddenly getting hundreds of views per day? You want to know, you know, where that critical content is and that it's adequately supported. And things like change tracking, not only content changes, but what about security changes? That's all important as well. And how about auditing? So this kind of data is invaluable for compliance and audits and security investigations. And for security, by the way, you'll want to have not only the usage log data, but I also propose keeping snapshots of your security. So for instance, the workspace security was set to be this at the end of every week. So then between the two, you can always go back and answer those questions for who had access to this content. To really get the full picture, you'll also have to pull the members of your security groups and marry that up as well. And we'll talk more about that here in a second. With regard to adoption efforts, so usage itself is a big part of adoption, but it's not the only part. And think about it this way. So more usage stats is not always positive. More and more downloads, is that a good thing? Or more and more data models? It's not always good to see bigger counts. So adoption of a digital tool is also about using the technology the way it was intended, which obviously is harder to track, of course. Data trustworthiness levels, so we can try to start determining what's our percentage of certified data sets versus activity that's happening from reports, and how many data sets are supporting more than one report, things like that. With regard to licensing, do we have some pro licenses that are not actively being used for publishing content? Or do we have pro users that are only consuming that could maybe view everything in premium instead? Things like that. And usage patterns. So do we see perhaps a significant number of subscriptions in place and not very much interactive report rendering? So things like that we can start to understand. Do we have needs that aren't really quite being met? And, you know, should we start thinking about doing some refactoring? And then training. What if you find someone doing a lot of sharing from My Workspace and you decided to send them a message and direct them for information about why workspaces and apps are better? Or what if you see a lot of data sets published by the same author that could be duplicative and you direct them to information about shared data sets? Or, I love this one, what if you detected the first time a newly licensed user views or publishes content, so you direct them to make sure they know about the internal training and documentation, things like that. And finally, suspicious usage. So maybe you're suddenly seeing yesterday someone did a lot of data exports and they don't typically do that. What does that mean? So as you can see, this data is gold. We can do a whole lot of things with it. So from the perspective of an end-to-end solution, this is what is usually involved. So starting at the top left, we get that activity data out of either the Power BI activity log or straight out of the Office 365 Management API. We also marry that data up with some data from the REST APIs. So we've got, say, workspace inventories, things like how many reports and data sets do we have? And the reason that that's helpful is because if you've got the full workspace inventory at certain increments, and usually maybe monthly might be enough for that, you've got the information to say, oh, well, you know what? About 25% of the reports in this workspace haven't been run in 6 months. Do we even need them anymore to be, active and published up there? Things like that. Workspace security can be very helpful for auditing. We want to get data out of Azure Active Directory. So who are all of our users? And by that, I mean, in the activity log, all we have is an email address. So out of Azure AD, we can get things like full name, and then depending on your metadata, what department do you work for, etc. Group memberships, who has Power BI licenses. There's also gateway logs that we'll talk more about in a little bit. All of that we usually pull through PowerShell, and then moving to the bottom left, what I like to do is put all of that raw data somewhere where it's safe, especially the activity log data. So the ideal situation there is it's stored the original JSON data. So you have not parsed it yet. You have not tried to put structure around it yet. And the reason that that's important is new auditing elements are being added all the time. So if you're parsing it in your very initial first query, you're going to miss when something new comes in, then you're going to have to go re-extract it. Whereas if you just pull that raw data, plop it in a data lake, you've got it, you can always re-prepare it going between the data lake and your auditing database. The other thing that's really nice, if you need that activity data to be reliable for auditing or compliance, you can make sure that that data lake area is immutable, meaning as soon as that file is written, it can't be deleted and it can't be changed. So an administrator cannot go in and delete out that record that says I did such and such. And of course, we trust them all, but and then as you'd expect, we've got our prepared data, and then we do various reports, and we can even make it available to users throughout the organization that want to understand more about what's happening inside of their solutions. So that's what I typically deploy. The piece that's not depicted here is Azure Monitor is on the public release plan. So how that might change some things here, I don't know yet, but that's just kind of an asterisk to know for now. There's a bunch of different ways that we can go and get the usage monitoring data. I'm actually not going to take the time to go through the differences between each of them and all that. What I would say is start with, if you're not doing it yet, start with the Power BI activity log because it's easiest. It's the easiest way to get started, and much less effort than the management API out of Office 365 or now Microsoft 365. So if you're going to take on usage monitoring, a few things. One is, what is your normal? So you started seeing something that you think is atypical, right? Making sure that you have the data to know what normal really is. You need to accumulate history. If we can accumulate up to 2 years of activity log data, that's ideal, because then we can see trending over time and we can see adoption and changes in behavior over time. Here's that securely retain your raw data files. I already went through all of that a moment ago, and correlate the data. You saw me do that on the diagram. Just like anything in data warehousing and data analysis, when we correlate other data together, it's more valuable. So what I would like to know is, at this point in time, if you're currently capturing your audit log data And are you aware of which technique you are using to capture that data? Okay, for the few people that are using that third one listed, the older PowerShell commandlet, my suggestion would be to convert that to using the new PowerShell commandlet, because it's got a lot less shortcomings. I won't go down a rabbit hole there, but it's way better. Okay. Let me do this other related section quickly, and then we'll stop for questions one more time. So with regard to automation, we generally have two options. One is PowerShell and the other are REST APIs. With the PowerShell side of things, there are two modules that are maintained by Microsoft. There's, of course, various third-party and open source things out there. We've got a fantastic community that makes things available, but I'm just going to focus on the ones that are produced by Microsoft. And so the management module and the gateway module. Now, when you use the modules, what's interesting is there are two scopes. So an admin can use an organizational scope for gathering metadata about the entire tenant. So for instance, that a few minutes ago when I said getting a workspace inventory, that's how you would go about doing that. But there's an individual scope too. So let's say you've got a technical user sitting down in the finance department that says, I'm not scared of PowerShell. I want to pull some of this data for myself. They can use their own, individual permissions to gather data about their own content. The other thing to be aware of is that the PowerShell modules are updated regularly. So you do need to make sure to keep them current on, both your workstation, if things are scheduled on servers, and make sure that those are at least fairly current. So the Power BI management module, there are several modules for managing Power BI, right? There's an admin module, data reports, workspaces, etc. So we can do things like, this is where you get the activity log data. We can not only get information like users and workspaces, etc., but we can actually create and edit certain things as well. I think that's in the wrong order, but I'll ask you now anyways. That should have been one slide later. But the question that I have for you is, at this point, have you invested in automation very much? And if so, are you doing some interesting things with it? And this one's more of a free form text rather than a multiple choice. So I'll give you all a moment to answer this, and I'm going to come back to it in a second, but the poll will still be available for you to type into. The gateway module, this is a separate module, and here's where you can do things like get a list of your gateway clusters, get a list of your data sources. Just recently, it started with being able to install a gateway cluster, and since the gateways are updated once a month, being able to do that programmatically is very helpful. Things like maybe your data source credentials change every 90 days and it's out of your control. Somebody else manages it. You just have to handle that change in password on occasion. We could set up a script to make that easier, and you don't have to go in, click. Now, the one thing to know about the Data Gateway module is that it's supported only on PowerShell Core. So that is different from the Power BI management module that all the other stuff is part of. That one does support Windows PowerShell still. So this one's a little bit more restrictive, focusing a little bit more on the future. And then the other piece of things is the REST APIs. So a whole bunch of different things we can do with the REST APIs, and here's just a few things to be aware of. One is you can do more stuff with the REST APIs than you can do with the management module. There's also less things you can do with the APIs than in the Power BI service browser. I don't know what the goal is as far as parity there. I would guess that over time we'll see more and more things that you can do both ways. Now, the thing that you can do that is very cool is you can combine the management module and the APIs. So let's say you love the management module for how easy it is to just log in with your Power BI administrator account, right? Oh, we don't need to mess with an Azure AD app, you know, the service principal thing. So you can log in with the management module, and then you can call an API just kind of using the management module as your wrapper, so to speak. So you can do some very cool things there that kind of give you the best of both worlds. So let me go back just a little bit. But it gave me anything interesting here. Basic investment in the pro licenses, okay. Power BI templates, thinking to deploy Power Automate and Power Apps. Yeah, that could be cool. Okay, interesting. Thanks, everybody. You know, also in this vein of a very new thing that's still in preview is this notion of an XMLA endpoint. And it's really, how can I communicate with Power BI from something that's not Power BI? So maybe Management Studio, maybe Visual Studio, maybe a third-party tool. So this is not only how we can do things like deploying a model programmatically or managing a model through another tool. It's also a way that you can slap another reporting tool on top of Power BI and use a Power BI data set. So, so very interesting. It does require dedicated capacity to be able to use it. So that's a thing to be aware of. And then the last thing that I want to talk about in this section is the need to manage your user machines and your devices. So we've got a few different options for Power BI software. And the biggest thing there to be aware of is that Power BI Desktop is updated monthly, and for different authors to be able to collaborate together on the same Power BI Desktop file. So let's say Lucy is going to finish the model and the calculations, and then Daphne is going to take over and do the reports. And then Lucy's going to open it up again to fine tune some things, right? You get the idea. They need to be on the same version. So the optimal way to get this done is somehow how it's pushed. If your organization allows the Microsoft Store, that's perfect. Then even bug fixes are pushed automatically. You don't even have to worry about it. You can also use organizational deployment methods, you know, System Center and all that kind of stuff. There's also an installer from the web if you need to control it a different way as well. And then there's other kinds of things that you might also want to be pushing onto user machines. So let's say Oracle is a very common data source for people working with Power BI Desktop. You're going to want to install drivers. Or the Microsoft Access driver, that kind of thing. There's an Analyze in Excel provider that you might want to just automatically install for everybody. There's some group policy settings. The most common one is that custom visuals one that we talked about a few minutes ago. And then if your org has made use of any custom connectors that have been created either by you or by a third party to get to a specialty type of data source. So incidentally, these kinds of things, in addition to installing them on the user machines, you would also need to install on a gateway machine, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. So speaking of which, let me check for questions. All right, y'all are oh, thank you, Prathy. Oh, what's the difference between a content pack and an app workspace? We can cover that one. Somebody, whoops, we don't need that. Wrong click. All right, so let's go out here. So in Power BI, everything is stored in a workspace. So either my workspace or And you used the term app workspaces. I think they're just not using the term app as a prefix anymore, but app workspaces are the rest of these things that we say, I need to organize my content in a certain way. So it's also content organization and it's a security boundary. So sales analytics, as an example, is my workspace in that way. Now, you said the words content pack, and so I'm going to shift that a little bit to the word app. Organizational content packs are deprecated. If you're still using them, you want to really make an active plan to migrate away from them. And instead, you want to use apps. So inside a workspace, you basically have a toggle for every report object and dashboard object. Should that object be in the app, yes or no? And so let me jump to what a published app looks like. For all of the items that had that toggle as yes, they will be included in this app right here that is called Sales Analytics. And this is a nicer way of deploying data to a huge number of consumers. So my favorite example of that is, let's say I have 150 salespeople and I have this package of sales reports. And so you can see I've got a nice menu over here on the left. I've even got a hyperlink over here to say, well, let me make a quick reference to my different sales KPIs, right? I can do things like that really make the experience a little bit nicer for consumption than just the straight up workspace experience. And so just to kind of finish this whole conversation, I'm back in that same workspace where the content started. So you have a one-to-one relationship between the workspace and the app. I just went to the Update App button. And so in order to get to where we just looked at for a publish app, you can see I've got, a name, a description. If we have a nice little support site, here's where I set my navigation. So I can create sections, I can create links, and I can reorder the different reports and dashboards however I'd like for them to be. And then finally, this part is key. Who has access to this app? So I have said the sales group this is an AAD group, has access to this app. So it's a separate layer of security so that what you can do is in the workspace, those are the people that have the ability to see content behind the scenes almost, usually the people that are publishing content and collaborating to a certain extent. And then there's a few other things here as well that affect the user experience quite a bit. And then last but not least, if you expand the links down here, if you're doing any sort of, embedding or whatever, you can get, direct links and so forth. So there's more to it, but that's your kind of flyby difference between those different objects. Okay, so that makes us ready for security. So first of all, the thing you need to know is that in order to use the Power BI service, everybody needs either a free or a pro account with two exceptions. One is you're actually not in the Power BI service and you're viewing the data somewhere else like publish to web, or you're viewing the data through Power BI embedded and the application itself is managing authentication. So really the message here is your user identity is critical because it's integrated with Azure Active Directory. And your groups from Azure or your Microsoft 365 Office groups are all supported as well. Now, the other thing with Azure AD that you may want to seriously think about is conditional access policies. So here's a few things that could really kind of help things. So let's say you need to block unauthorized access from not on the network or a machine that is not owned by the company, things of that nature. Maybe you only want to allow logins to Power BI from certain AAD groups. So even beyond just the you have a Power BI license, but you also have to be a member of such and such group, right? So if you have some sort of policies in place, those sorts of things can help enforce a workflow almost. You can also reduce the number of devices that can connect if that happens to be of relevance. Now, there's also identity governance inside of Azure AD that gives you some interesting things. So one of them that you might find useful is called terms of use. And where this could be helpful is, for instance, maybe before you get your Power BI license, you want to have users agree to data privacy or a data handling policy. So you could have them basically acknowledge or consent through this terms of use that's just set up through Azure AD. There's also the notion of access reviews. And the goal here is to find an issue before an auditor does. So you would periodically review your administrators or your sensitive groups at key points in time. And then the third thing we talked about earlier at the beginning of this conversation about PIM. So our getting just-in-time access to the Power BI administrator role, for instance, so that we reduce our risk of having too many full-time admins. This is a diagram that is also on my website, and I've got a video about it. I'm not going to go through all of the various aspects of this. What I really just want to mention from an administrator perspective is that there's a need to have training for your content authors of what are your security best practices? When do you want them to use groups rather than individuals? And how do you want them to manage certain aspects? Because there's a whole lot of things, as you can see, that are in control by your content author, by that business user that is setting forth various security policies. So with regard to permissions for the gateway, and we need to talk about the gateway still, but from the permissions or security standpoint, there's a few aspects here. One of them is the administrators, and that's set at the gateway level. And then for every individual data source, you're going to have stored credentials. So maybe you've got an ID and password for a server. That's actually gotten more flexible just recently. But then there's also, is single sign-on allowed for this data source or not? And then there's also a data privacy level per data source. And that's actually a more important thing than you might think. And Chris Webb has talked at length about privacy levels and has lots of good info. So I'm going to save the time from going down a rabbit hole there. Now, something that a lot of people don't think about from a security standpoint is about where files are stored. And so think about things like that PBIX file from Power BI Desktop before you publish it to the service. If you have imported data into the PBIX, where is that thing saved? Preferably, it's in OneDrive or SharePoint, some security that's still aligned with the data that's in it, if not even exactly the same as where it's ending up at the Power BI service. But in addition to that, maybe there's some source data files. Maybe there's saved attachments from subscriptions. Maybe there's data exports, report exports, et cetera, et cetera. So giving your users guidance on where those should reside as well is a really good thing. Now, sensitivity labels are a fairly new feature. They're still in preview. And so what this does is it allows us to set a sensitivity label for individual objects. So let me show you briefly where you set them up. And so where I'm at here is in our O365 Security and Compliance Center. And under classification, there's an area called sensitivity labels. And here in my demo environment, I have set up 4 different labels. Internal, restricted, and highly confidential are the 3 of note. And so once those are set up, and once our tenant setting in the service has allowed us to say, yes, you're allowed to use the sensitivity labels, then I can assign them per individual object. And so the little I information basically gives us the description that was configured back in the security center. So this is integrated with Microsoft 365 stuff, so it also influences Excel and other Office products and so forth. In the admin center, there is a little report that shows us, well, which of those labels across the whole tenant are being used. And it lets you jump over to Cloud App Security, which we saw briefly earlier. But this kind of just, gives you a quick view of what's there. Interestingly, this report is set up in your My Workspace for each one of the individual admins. So I assume that that's just because it's in preview and it will ultimately become an actual app. So with regard to sensitivity labels, in order to make them actually meaningful, what I suggest is you have a data handling policy for each one of those labels. What can you or you cannot do if it is set to be that particular label? So are we allowed to access it? So usually the label itself deems who's allowed to access it, right? If you name them well. Are you allowed to download it? Do you have to have markings required? So when you configure it, you can say there's a footer or there's a watermark, that kind of thing. And if you're using this data, so maybe it's highly confidential type of data, and if you're going to use this data for certain types of reporting, are you going to be required to anonymize that data first? So things of that nature that turn around and make it not just informational, but actionable. Over in Cloud App Security again, one really interesting thing are these policies that are detecting risky activities. So if I pop back over there to Cloud App Security and I go back to policies, these 2 that are listed first, I did not set these up. These are system configured. And so basically what they're fancy AI, basically trying to say, as compared to your typical activity, I am detecting, I'm detecting an anomaly. So I didn't have to configure these. The only thing that I did different is I said, well, yeah, if this happens, send me an email. And I happened to say, I want it to go to my Power BI administrators and my security administrators group. But otherwise, this one happens to just be managed by the system. And you can see that there's not settings that I can monkey with because it's set by the system. So I think those are pretty cool. I'm interested to see what comes. These are the first 2 that we've seen. So we'll see what else happens there. Other things that aren't necessarily Power BI related. So you can see down here, we've got a impossible travel. We've got it's detecting some leaked credentials, unusual file share. So there's some other things that are not necessarily directly Power BI, but could also be helpful from your administrative perspective. And the very last thing in this section that I want to mention is that there are a variety of encryption keys that you'll have to kind of decide how are you going to manage these, right? So if you've got a security vault, a corporate vault that you use, that's always the ideal solution. But here's the ones that you want to be concerned with. Okay, so gateway is next. Let me check comments and do a quick time check. All right, we have gateways and premium left before we do a final wrap up. And I am running a bit late, so we will pick up the pace on these next two sections so that I don't keep you too terribly long. Organizing workspaces is a question. Do you think it's an open question or it depends? Could be stakeholder-led structures or subject-led structures and will differ by company, business unit requirement. One size does not fit all. Do you have any advice on how people decide? I have got a different presentation on my website, and at the end I'll remind you what the URL is again. Well, it's coatesdatastrategies.com/presentations. And the third one listed there is going to be best practices for sharing and distributing content in Power BI. I've got a variety of pieces of info in there. And then we also talked in the latest revision of that white paper a little bit too about deciding on scope. But you're absolutely right. It's not a one size fits all. It's a content boundary and a security boundary. So where a lot of people start is they think along the same lines as the organizational structure. Oh, I'm going to set one up for my team. And then they decide very quickly, either A, it's too broad because there's too much stuff in there, or they start inviting other people through either workspace security or sharing or whatever, and suddenly that name now doesn't actually mean anything. So my first advice would be focus on the topic rather than the org structure. And then try to find that balance between, yeah, you don't want to have to navigate through, 300 workspaces necessarily, but I usually tend to lean towards narrower versus broader. Search is helping that for sure, but we don't have folders inside of a workspace. So that's why I still tend to lean towards being a little bit more narrow than broad. Okay, so data gateways. Hang on a second here. There we go. Okay, we have two types of gateways. There is a personal mode and there is a standard mode. I still tend to want to call it enterprise, but the official name is standard mode. And also they are called a gateway cluster. And it's still used, the word cluster is still used even if there's a single server in the gateway. But what this picture is intending to represent is that I have 3 servers inside my standard mode cluster. So the two different modes have some different distinctions. Really, the idea is that the standard mode, your gateway administrator is setting that up and managing it for use by many different people, and it supports not only data refresh, but also direct query and live connections. Whereas personal mode is running on somebody's laptop for their personal data refresh in Power BI, and that is all. So conceptually, what's happening with a standard mode gateway is at the very bottom middle, we've got some data sources that are somewhere that we can't reach. And so it's going to, that connectivity is going to happen through the data gateway and up through the cloud service. And the standard mode, the same gateway server architecture can be shared among these different services. But as of right now, if I configured a data source in, say, Power BI gateway, it's actually not shared by all of these other apps. So I have no idea if that's going to change or not. But as of right now, it's just think of it as the gateway server architecture for connectivity, really mostly is what's being shared. So let's make sure you know when a gateway is really needed. So first of all, it's not needed while the user is working in Power BI desktop, but once their solution has been published to the service, when you need to refresh either a data set or a data flow, or you need to use direct query or live connection. You need a gateway for that, and your data source is located either in your on-premises data center or in the cloud. So in the cloud could be like a VM or even a platform as a service like Azure SQL Database, perhaps, if it's sitting in a virtual network, because in that case, it's acting as if it's in your corporate data center. So I mention all that because there's a lot of times people say, oh, if it's a cloud data source, you don't need a gateway. And that's not true entirely, especially because more and more companies are using VNets more so. And then there are other individual pieces of functionality that if you use them, you will need a gateway. And this is not a complete list. It's a couple of examples actually that I got from Chris Webb. So just be aware that there's this once in a while it's needed because of the activity you are performing. I'm not going to go through all this in the yeses and nos because that would be really boring for both of us. What I want to convey here is that you've got multiple places where you're going to be going to manage your gateways. So in addition to the Power BI service, you've got a thing called the Power Platform Admin Center that I'm going to show you here in a second. There's also the gateway server itself, so the hardware, right? That's where you install the gateway software. And then there's the aspect of PowerShell. There's certain things that you can do that way rather than through the browser interface. Let me show you this interactively. So the Power Platform Admin Center is where we can do a couple of things that we cannot do in the Power BI service. So the things that we can do in both, I can see that, oh, I have this one gateway called Data Gateway Prod, and I can manage its settings, or I can manage, here it says users. What they mean over here is administrators, okay? So if I say manage users, this is at the gateway level. These are my admins, not data source users. But the thing that I really want to call your attention to is this ability to manage gateway installers. So here we are saying Griffin and Peyton are the two people who are allowed to install gateways in the organization, and I otherwise have it restricted. There's also in PowerShell some policies you can set to say, do I want to allow personal gateways, yes or no? So you can kind of use the list of gateway installers and those policies together to accomplish what you need to accomplish. If I pop back over to Power BI, here's the regular Power BI view where I see that same gateway. Here it says administrators, and here's those two people that I saw as users in the Power Platform Admin Center. And then underneath here, I've got one data source, and you know, we've got its configuration, right? So here's some credentials that I have stored for that data source. Another reason why we could consider it a highly privileged role, because you can be privy to these kinds of things. And then some other things like SSO, the advanced settings differ depending on what kind of data source. But here we have users, and we've got which users are allowed to use this particular data source. And I will elaborate on that here in just one moment. At the moment, what I want to know from you is, do you allow the use of personal gateways at your company? Okay, predominantly no. All right, thanks everybody. No, the yeses are rallying. Okay, thanks everybody. So gateway clusters, I propose that your production gateway cluster always has at least 2 machines for these reasons: high availability, and by that we mean you don't have a single point of failure. You know, one machine croaks, the other machine can take over the load. When you're doing the monthly gateway software updates, you can make sure that your production gateway is still up and running because you're installing the software on machine 1 while machine 2 still satisfying the load. It's still allowing data refreshes or direct query or live connection activity to be happening. So if you've been doing updates at 2 a.m. so that you don't bother users, this is at least an alternative to reduce some risk. And then it also handles some load balancing. So depending on the level of activity that's happening on the gateway servers, and I'll elaborate on that here in a second too. I also propose that you have a dev test gateway cluster. Now, it could be less machines. It could even be one machine if that's all you want to mess with. But what that's really, really good for is you have a place to test that gateway software update. And then preferably, you've got a few reports that you run. A report that says, okay, I'm going to run a refresh and make sure that succeeds. I'm going to run a direct query, make sure that succeeds. I'm going to run another direct query from another data source. I'm going to run a live connection. You get the idea, right? We do a handful of different repeatable things, make sure nothing breaks, make sure the logs are still capturing data after the software update, yada, yada, yada. In terms of specs, one thing that I did not initially know some time ago was that the gateway does more than just connectivity. Connectivity is really important to reach that data source, but when the work cannot be done by the source system, that is folding, query folding and all that kind of thing, sometimes the work needs to be done on the gateway server. So filtering or data merges or whatever, your data privacy settings can also have an impact on how much work can get pushed down versus being done on the gateway server. And so rule of thumb is that CPU is important for direct query and live connection. Memory is always way, way, way important for data refresh. And then of course, networking is, always important. So question for you, whoops, let me go back. Do you have at least 2 machines in your production gateway? Oh, I haven't convinced some people, eh? Alrighty then. Depending on what you're doing, if you've got lots and lots and lots of end users, it gets to be far more important. So yeah, I can understand why sometimes we don't need to over-engineer. All right, good deal. So we kind of talked about this briefly on the user machines. We've got different things that we need to make sure get installed on the gateway server. So that is something that, let's say a user uploads a PBIX to the service, tries to say schedule a refresh, it doesn't work. This is possibly one reason why it doesn't work. Here's another reason why users might get frustrated sometimes. So the users are set at every individual data source. And so when they use a new data source that isn't registered to the gateway cluster, activity will fail. Or if the user is not listed in the user list for the data source, meaning that user is not allowed to choose it for, performing data refresh, etc. So my suggestion is to be very prepared with your user support people, however you handle that, to quickly handle failures in the service related to new data sources or user permissions. With regard to monitoring gateway health, several months ago that got way easier. So we no longer have to go reach into perfmon and that sort of thing. We can, in some config files, we can enable logging. And what we get spit out on each local gateway machine is these 4 files, if both types of logging are enabled. And then we can set the interval. So let's say we want to know every 5 minutes or 2 minutes or whatever, what's the level of CPU and memory consumption? So we've got very easily accessible data in order to be able to see, well, what are the busy times on my gateway? Can I maybe move some things to a broader time range to take it easier on the machine? Or we're seeing week over week the machine get more and more bogged down. We better scale up or scale out. So these things are absolutely great. My suggestion is to write the files locally on the machine. It does that by default. I usually change the path because the default's in kind of a funky spot. But still write the machines to a local spot and then pick them up, move them elsewhere, and then depending on what you're doing, you may want to move them into your curated database, or you may not care. This is something where long-term trending is not nearly as valuable, so it may not be worth it. But you may need to pull them from every single individual gateway server and consolidate them in one place. All right, premium capacity. This is our last big section. So since we're so close to the end, Prathy and James, if you would just kind of keep an eye on what's there, and we're going to hit the rest of the questions at the end if that's all right with everybody. So first question is, are you using premium now? Okay. Very interesting. I like it. Okay, thanks. So let me just real quickly go through, why is it that we think about using premium? So the first use case is really you've got a large number of read-only users, and you don't want to buy a pro license for all of them. So it can get to be more cost-effective. Past, usually that rule of thumb is about 500 view-only people. Scalability, so things like large data set support that's now in preview. Incremental data refresh used to fall in this category, but it's been made available to all pro users due to customer demand. But we do get more frequent refreshes as well. 48 a day rather than 8, although if you do it through the XML endpoint, I believe there is actually no limit per day. Might also be true of the API. I got to double check my thought there. Kind of trying to bring some enterprise features to self-service BI. So things like deployment pipelines, which are a new capability for deploying to dev, test, prod workspaces that makes that whole process a little bit easier. Data flows features are opened up to include things like linked and computed entities. There's an enhanced compute engine for data flows, things like that. In compliance area, there's a multi-geo feature that supports data residency requirements for where data is stored. So you can specify it shouldn't leave the borders of a certain country, that sort of thing. Some of the AI integration falls under premium. Right now, I believe they're still hooked in with data flows as far as I'm aware. And then hybrid. So if you buy premium, you also get a license to Power BI report server for the same number of cores. So that can be helpful if you have one group of people that doesn't really want to use the Power BI service. They're more comfortable with using Power BI report server. And so you can use both. So here's another one of those free form questions that I'm going to give you a couple minutes to tell me, but is there a feature or two that really pushed you over the edge to go to premium, or that now you just can't live without? Something like that. So I'm going to give you a minute to do that. I'm going to come back and check your answers. And meanwhile, I will introduce what the two kinds of capacity are. And so the first thing I want to tell you is when people say the word premium, especially bloggers, I can tell when I read it, some people mean any type of capacity, either one. And some people literally mean the Power BI premium SKU. So let me break down the two types. So Power BI premium has a P series SKU, and there's also an EM series SKU underneath it that I'm not really going to talk about, but it's different than when you buy Power BI Embedded, which is an A series SKU that's bought by Azure. And so premium, you basically agree to either an annual commitment or a monthly commitment, whereas Power BI Embedded, being an Azure service, you can pause it. In fact, that's how I run my demo environment. when we're done with this presentation, Power BI Embedded will be paused until I need it again, so I don't have to pay for it when I'm not using it. So it's really designed to scale up, down, and pause when you don't need it. And Power BI Premium is really more like, this is the level that you need, and it's going to be up and running 24/7. So I mention this especially if you just need to evaluate some premium features before making a commitment, or you don't need them 24/7. Here's an example. You want to send some paginated report subscriptions once a day or once a week. What you could do is start your premium capacity, execute the subscriptions, send them out, and then pause the capacity from Power BI Embedded. I'm sorry if I said premium a moment ago. So that could be done with your A series SKUs. So things like that, you don't need it up and running 24/7. So when you buy premium capacity, so let's say we bought 32 vCores, that's a P3. I don't actually have to set them up in the Power BI service. I don't have to carve them up the exact same way. So let's say I defined 3 different capacities. They all add up to the 32. And then I assign workspaces to each of the capacities. So the features that I need only apply to the workspaces that have been assigned to a capacity. So for each individual capacity that I've defined in the Power BI service, then I've got these different knobs to manage the workloads. So if I don't want anybody to use paginated reports, I turn it off. If I don't want anybody to use the AI workloads, I turn it off. If I want data flows to be able to have more than 20% max memory, I jack that up. You get the idea. So one of your key decisions from an administration perspective is, let's take that P3 of 32 vCores. Do you want multiple smaller capacities, which let's say you've got isolated workloads, or maybe you need separate capacity admins. That's when you start carving it up. But then you got a trade-off for sure. A larger capacity, as you can see from this chart down below, I get larger models. I get more parallelism with the larger capacity. So definitely got to decide what you need from them to figure out how you carve up the capacities that you buy. With respect to monitoring capacity health, there's basically 3 aspects. So one is the Premium Capacity Metrics app. So that's the built-in reports. It's right there on the premium page. You can't miss it. There's now a template app for it, so you can create custom reports from that data set and customize them to be whatever it is you need them. There's also in the tenant settings, you can get notifications if there's any sort of incident happening, or if your capacity is overloaded. That just came out sometime in the last several weeks. And finally, data from the activity log can be helpful. So maybe you set up the capacity to expect certain things from the workspaces that are assigned to it, but you're seeing different things happen. And so that can kind of help you understand what is really happening. All right, before we open it up for Q&A, I want to leave you with just a few suggestions. And so let's say you are just getting started overseeing Power BI. What do you do first? So first, I want you to start capturing that activity log data. Don't parse it, just start capturing the raw data so you have the history. Tenant settings, I want you to validate and document them. And in the newest version of the Planning a Power BI Enterprise Deployment white paper, there's a link at the end, we put in some tenant setting recommendations. We backed off on a couple of them, so they're not always extremely prescriptive. However, I think that they're helpful. Validate who's been granted your Power BI administrative role and try to minimize, the number of people for that. And bump up your gateway server if it makes sense to, and it's currently a single node, just to avoid it being a single point of failure, because that could be disruptive to users if something should go wrong with that gateway server. So let's say you've got the basics taken care of. What do you do next? I propose, now that you've got your activity log data, get it in a form so that you can create your analytical reporting, and augment that activity log with other kinds of data that will make it be even more useful. And review how your workspaces and your apps are being used. Review naming conventions. Are there things that can just fundamentally make it easier for users? And do an end-to-end security review. Start capturing that data. Make sure that you can backtrack if you need to. All right, so let's say you're pretty mature. You're feeling pretty good about yourself. Well, what might you tackle next? So first, let's start looking for some circumstances where you can take action early rather than be reactive. Start thinking about, can we help our user population improve things like our data trustworthiness, and consistency and data certification, and that might involve working with a governance team and that sort of thing. And then think about things like data classifications, and that your policies, if you have certain ones, how are they managed and how are they audited? So my final remarks are, there's a release plan that's updated twice a year. Follow it closely, because some things that are coming down the pipe will require planning. So for instance, the new workspace experience, you're going to need to do upgrades from the older experience to the new experience. Preferably you want to do that before you're forced to by the system. That move that we mentioned earlier about from organizational content packs to apps, things like that. You also want to follow the Power BI blog really closely if you're not already. So from an administrator perspective, that's where I find out things like, oh, there's a new PowerShell set of commandlets, or, oh, as of next month, the gateway is going to require a newer .NET version, right? Things like that. And information online gets out of date quickly. So just be careful, right? We got tons of bloggers, but something they wrote 3 months ago may or may not be correct anymore. And I'm, just as guilty of that as the next person. So just being aware, I think we all feel the high pace of change. Don't make your administrative decisions on the fly, right? Don't just say, oh, there's a new switch to prevent who can install a gateway. Okay, I'm just going to go set it up, right? We want you to be more of a partner with the business, if you will, because your role is helping get things done. Your role is not to just say no and be protective of the data. And I do realize we do also have to protect the data, but try to be proactive. Try to get into the world of automation. Any of you that are already administrators, that's obviously going to be close to your heart. And technical proofs of concepts all the time. So new features always come out as a minimally viable product. They need time to evolve and mature. So lots and lots and lots of times we just can't assume without a quick POC. So my last question for you, that I'm going to let this go while we're doing Q&A, is just if you have any significant challenges with administering Power BI that you want to share. So that will be our last question that I have for you. And meanwhile, we can do Q&A. The only other thing I want to do is remind you where all the links are. And then I've also got just a whole bunch of URLs at the back of this deck. So I will leave this there for the moment if you need to grab it. And let's check and see what we've got for questions. Thank you for the roundup, Prathy. I'm going to start there. Can we have Gateway as a service? Oh, sure, why not? I'm just kidding. I I don't know. That's interesting thought. Any feedback on Power BI Sentinel, particularly for small companies whose IT administrators don't have time to focus on Power BI monitoring, disaster recovery, toolkit, lineage, backups, blah, 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 blah. I have not used it directly. It has been sort of on my long list of rainy day projects to get in touch with them and say, hey, can you let me check this out so I know exactly what it does? So I would imagine that yes, it is a huge time saver. But do keep in mind that they're subject to the things they're allowed to do are the same APIs that we all have access to. So something like downloading a report or a data set from the service would incur the same limitations that we would incur if we do the same thing. So absolutely, use that service if you're allowed to buy it. But in terms of some of the quirky behaviors that we might experience, it would tend to have the same ones. Let me scroll up a bit, see if we got anything else. Got that. Block personal gateways, we covered that. So I think we got all the questions. If there's any we haven't handled, now's your chance to unmute and get them handled before we say goodbye and call it a day. All right. Well, we went a little bit long today, so thank you very much for your patience. Let me go back here real quick and see what answers we got here. Yeah, I hear you. So thank you, Prathi and James, for having me. I appreciate it, and I have had a great bit of fun.
Oh, thank you, Melissa. It was really good. I'm just gonna share my screen. Is that okay, Melissa?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, cool. Oh, thank you so much. It was a really in-depth session. It was really, really nice. What do you say, James?
Yeah, absolutely. We're already seeing lots of really positive feedback on Twitter as well. So thank you very much indeed for doing our inaugural session as well.
Yeah, exactly. I can think of myself like, going back to this session and listening it to again, and there is tons of information, and not like it's like many people actually ignore like the whole thing, all the Power BI administration. And I think that this is one session which covered everything. So thank you again. For all the attendees. So as Melissa already shared the links for the slides and things, we will also post them later on the website. Please give us the feedback. There is a feedback link, and I will also post the feedback link in the chat. So yeah, please give us the feedback. And yeah, thank you so much for everyone, and especially to Melissa.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.